Hi, Christine. It's really lovely to have you back. Today we are going to be talking about overcoming barriers that people with tics may face in the workplace and like things people may feel anxious about in the workplace related to their tics. So Christine is like the employment specialist. So of course I'm making this video with Christine. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Romy. Thank you for asking. How are you? And I'm so glad to be back.
Oh, thank you. I am good, thank you. Tics getting worse in the work environment due to stress and feelings of pressure. Some people may feel like they really struggle in the workplace because of that, and their tics might get really bad when they're under pressure, and then when the tics get bad, it's harder to do the work. Do you think there's a way to overcome that sort of thing? Beans.
Well, first of all, it depends on a number of things. So let's start by saying that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. So there's three main things to consider. So the type of work, the type of work environment, and the person, right? So those are the three things to consider all the time. Because there's no one size fits all, but there are certain themes that apply on a regular basis, I always start with those three very important elements. So first, the Tourette themselves. That's a good place to start. The type of work the Tourette is doing, and the type of work environment. So those are three very basic things that all those situations will have to take in consideration. So first of all, the Tourette. What is affecting them, first of all? So is it the fact that they tic? Is it the fact that the stress is not from work, but is from other factors, which are related more to the neurology? Rather than the work stress, because managing a neurology is a full-time job in itself, and it takes a lot of energy away from the work itself. Again, depending on the kind of work you do. And the work environment. So those three things will always be there: the Tourette, the work, and the work environment. If it's an office environment, a call center, in a customer service capacity. So say the person ticking, their tics does not bother them, but it bothers their coworkers. Sometimes it happens, right? Most of us are very aware when our tics are disturbing. So we also know that other people have to work. So we either suppress, which is one way of dealing, not recommended in the long term, but it's one way to do it. Some of us can manage well, and some of us burn out at 42. So like I did. So that's one thing to consider. So you can choose to suppress, but that accommodates the world around you. So that's one way to do it. And then there's stress, because as a Tourette, there are things related to that. So sometimes we feel bad about interfering with our coworkers' work. Of course, you know, most of us are very sympathetic and have a lot of empathy for the world around us. We're also very aware of the world around us because we have to be. Sometimes we get anxious, as you mentioned. It's normal to get anxious about work performance and things like that. But in an office environment, if you are in a call center, reasonably, if you can do the work, but you can't do it in the environment of a call center, which has all the lights, all the other representatives, all the sounds, all the smells too, and all the activity that's always ongoing. So it's not unreasonable to ask to work from home. For an office worker, this is a reasonable accommodation. But if you're a Touretteer and your work is physical and you're, say, in an assembly line, some of us find a lot of comfort in the routine, and it helps alleviate the tics, knowing that there's, your body is going through a routine. Some of us, doing some physical activity helps through the tics. But for some other people, it interferes. So if it gets to the point where it interferes one way or the other, then you might have to consider something a little different, right? If you work on an assembly line, you can't reasonably do that from home, right? So is there something else that you could do for that employer, or should you look for another job, right? But typically employers will, especially if you're a good worker, if you demonstrate your work ethic, your employer might be able to put you in the orders department, for example, or something along those lines. Retraining is not uncommon in cases like that. Yeah. So again, both Touretters would require accommodations, but the accommodations would have to be different. Did that answer your question?
Yes, so it is very individualized. There's not specifically one answer on how to overcome it, because it really depends what all the factors are for the individual that's actually affecting them. If it's to do with the general pressures of work and that makes someone's tics worse, do you think having, well, I just had some ideas on how that pressure could be reduced on someone if that is what is making it worse for them. So things like either having breaks when they need it, like little breaks, or having flexible hours, or having a job where your deadlines are longer than daily, because if it's like a daily one, then people may stress because it always feels like the deadline is so close. I guess maybe if it's a deadline that's longer, you have longer to complete a project, that may put less stress on a person. And also just being, I mean, obviously this isn't an option for everyone, but if a person is able to, then they may choose to be self-employed if that takes the pressure off of them, because then they're their own boss potentially, and they don't have to worry about what other people are thinking of them and stuff. Those are just some things I came up with in my notes when I was noting down about this. Beans.
Well, you do raise a lot of very valid points, and those are all great solutions and approaches that have worked for many people. Self-employment is definitely a route that many of us take. Not all of us are able to, because there is an economic reality, but did you want to touch on that? It's good to have support if you are self-employed. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but here in Canada and the US, to become self-employed, you definitely need some other kind of support prior to doing something like that full time.
Also, the money it costs to set up. Sorry, there's also the money it costs to actually set up being self-employed in the first place. So if you don't have the money to begin with, then that may unfortunately not really be an option. Beans.
Right. So when it comes to work pressure, work pressure, we all experience it, whether we are neurotypical or neurodivergent. It's a very normal human thing to have happen, right? So it means that, first of all, you care about your work. And because you work there, obviously you had certain qualifications that made you qualified for the work. So if it stems from anxiety and having to manage the anxiety, as you say, depending on the kind of work you do, choose work that will allow for that kind of flexibility, that you have the ability to take breaks, or to have a more flexible schedule. And it's not only for neurodivergence, right? A lot of companies already allow for flexible schedules. So for example, a lot of parents looking after kids, or people looking after their parents, their aging parents. There's a lot of companies that are already quite willing to offer that kind of flexibility in the work. Why that's not always extended to Touretters and neurodivergence does not always make sense to me. So that's a big one. If it comes down to the anxiety aspect or the ADHD aspect that many of us Touretters have, also autistics have, sometimes asking for more specific instructions could help.
Yeah.
So having a manager or a team leader that can be very clear as to what they need and when they need them, right? Because many of us, when we're told, like, you can do that whenever, it kind of goes to the very back, and everything else that comes up will take priority. And then when you're asked, it's like, well, what is this happening? Well, you said whenever. Oh, well, whenever is today. Oh, okay. So it's good to have very definite set expectations, whether it's in dates, whether it's in the kind of work. So if you want something that's going to be visually pleasing, you need to enunciate that. If you need something that's going to be, do you want it in an Excel sheet? Do you want it in PDF? Do you want it in Word? Like, how do you want it? So being very specific can help alleviate a lot of those anxieties.
It gets rid of the uncertainty, and like people might worry about whether they're actually doing it correctly or as expected. And then that anxiety can make the tics worse, which makes it more difficult to do it. So I think if there's less uncertainty as to what is actually expected, that can definitely help.
Mm-hmm. Right. So clear communication is actually, from a lot of the people I speak with or interact with, that seems to be the number one complaint. It's like, I can do the work, just tell me what you want, right? And yeah, for many of us, that doesn't quite work that way, and self-employment is the way we have to go. Yeah. So yeah, so that's my best answer. Again, we have to take in consideration the Touretteer, the work, and the work environment. So again, if it's an office environment, that's one way to deal with it. But clear communication is everywhere and required in any work environment. So yeah, just being clear about the expectations is very much the best thing we can ask of our managers and leaders.
Yes, definitely. And that's very, very good. I definitely think there needs to be a lot more clear communication. Okay, so the second sort of barrier that some people may feel is affecting them, or may affect their ability to do the work. If a person has destructive tics like throwing or hitting out, they may worry that that could affect their work functioning, and they may worry that they're going to break things or that they're going to like hit out at someone. What sort of advice would you give to someone with those sorts of tics when it comes to employment? Because I know that's a big issue for me. Destructive tics. My tics will just throw stuff. Things.
Okay, so if we start with the Touretteer, the work itself and the work environment. So you need to be in a space where you feel safe to tic, and the people around you feel safe while you tic as well. So let's start with physical safety. So physical safety, work from home is a good solution. And flex time, quite literally, because you don't know if you have a body that is unpredictable. Again, safety first. You know yourself, you know your triggers. So it's quite literally down to management. How do you manage it in the daily duties? So for example, if you have a tic where you throw things around, and you need to write things, maybe a voice to text software could be a good solution, a good accommodation. There is a social aspect. So of course, if you have to have team meetings, and we all, even introverts, need to connect with their colleagues and coworkers and friends, when you meet in person, just make sure everyone is physically safe. Just everyone is aware of what's going on. So yeah, just start. This is a case where I put safety first, like the environment, like everything is rolled into one, and it's still centered on the Touretteer and accommodating the Touretteer. Again, there is the element that it could be very confining and isolating. So there is a mental health aspect of that is important to consider and be mindful of in terms of the workplace, right? So maybe ask to touch base more often, right? So it can get lonely to work from home. Ask about additional communication devices, right? So are there more instant ways to stay connected to the team? Yeah, so that would be my best recommendation. I'm probably missing a lot of factors here. I'm speaking more in terms of where to start.
I definitely agree with the safety first thing, because you don't want to like throw something at someone's face and in the middle of the workplace. That probably wouldn't be the best thing. But yeah, definitely safety first. And I feel like I've had this in terms of like school accommodations, with seating, arranged seating. Like if you have hitting out tics, arranged seating, just so you're not gonna like hit out at someone when you tic. Simple things like that. Just be mindful of where you are sitting and stuff. If like, don't be too close to people if you have those sorts of tics. And I would say, if you aren't employed at this point and you are looking to choose a job, but you know that your tics are very destructive, I'd say probably just try not to work in a place with a lot of fragile things. Like probably not like a gift shop with loads of pottery and stuff. That would not end well. So
maybe
again,
a pillow factory.
Yes. That's actually really good.
Yeah.
Or maybe just places where you're not necessarily around items and stuff. Like, I don't know, this randomly came to my head. Like a supervisor at a trampoline park. Just a supervisor doesn't need to go near many items. They just supervise in that. So I don't know if that sort of thing would work. Maybe, but then you'd still every now and then probably need to go near people, and you can still hang out. So there is
but we're still able to do the work, right? So actually, we're still able to do that work. So we can still be a supervisor. We can still, like, even if your tics throw things around, you're still able to, like most of us, when we're in a focused activity, as long as it's safe to use the tools both for yourself and the people around you, right? So you have to be aware of what your tics may or may not do, right? So if you know that once you're focused, you can handle that drill, then that's fine, right? Or fix that spring or whatever this is. Yeah, actually, why not? Yeah, why not? I fully agree. I had not thought about something like this. I like it. I love this.
But yes, it's just I guess being mindful of yourself, and maybe just not applying jobs where you know your tics are probably going to destroy things. As right. I wouldn't apply to work at a pottery shop or a china shop because my tics would smash it all. That wouldn't end well. But there are still definitely things that we can do.
Yep. So yeah, so I really like the idea of a supervisor and someone keeping an eye on keeping watch on things.
Yeah, and
yeah.
like the reason why I randomly came up with a supervisor at a trampoline park is just because I know that, I don't know, at a trampoline park they kind of just stand and watch everyone. They don't necessarily have items around them to be able to throw the ticks. So that was just my random thought on that.
But there's also, but seriously, like there's also a lot of padding, right?
Yes.
So for those of us who do have those throwing ticks, having that padding available might allow us to redirect a lot of those ticks as well. Yeah. So yeah, so know yourself, know your environment, and what can we do within that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Coprolalia. Some people may be very anxious about working when they have coprolalia. They may be worried about like swearing at someone. They may worry about how people are going to react, members of the public, because in a lot of jobs you are public facing, not all of them, but there are a lot where they're public facing. People may worry, like, are people going to be really offended at my coprolalia? Is that going to impact me? So what sort of advice would you give to someone with coprolalia who's in that sort of situation with their work?
It really depends on the type of work, right? For example, I find if you are in social work, people might be a little more receptive and responsive, right? Depending on the work you do. It really comes down to work you do. So, yeah, you could be working for postal services, be able to sort the mail, tend to clients, and sometimes when it's not warranted and it's out of nowhere, people figure out pretty quickly that it's a tic. So a lot of employers are terrified about the coprolalia for customer-facing roles. But here's the thing. A lot of customers, when they are served by a disabled person or a person with a disability or customers presume competence. It's amazing. If you are there as a customer service representative facing the public, customers will presume that you are there to do a certain job. So there's a lot less fear from the public than we think. There's more fear from employers than there is fear from the public. So depending on where you are, so if you know it's someone with coprolalia that otherwise does a fantastic job, you can put a sign up. Hey, listen, I'm not swearing at you. It's coprolalia. Just put a sign. It's like, it's not a big deal. It's happening. You're going to hear foul language. It's not intentional. I'm otherwise a decent human being, and I'm here at your service. So that's one way to deal with it. But I find the fear is primarily from employers.
Yeah, as you said with the sign thing, I think a lot of it is about learning how to explain it, because I think there'll probably be a few people out there who will be a little bit offended, but I think just knowing how to explain it is really important. And then if people do get offended, it's like, whatever, I can't help it. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
but being able to explain it is really important. And wow, dealing with people who, hopefully rare, but dealing with people who might have a problem with it, be able to sort of calm that conflict and just explain, this is a condition, I have no control over it, it's not aimed at you, things like that.
You can tap the sign because seriously, there's only so many. It's exhausting having to justify yourselves for everything, right? So and especially, like, for example, if you are in a customer facing position, people come to know of it, right? You become part of it and people get used to it. Believe it or not, people do get used. to coprolalia. People do get used to the tics. People get used to it. Yeah, they do. We do. Again, I find there's more fear from the employers than there is from customers. If someone is competent, can do the job, has done the job.
Yeah. But with coprolalia, I see the issue as often not that you can't do the job, well, depending on what job it is, but for a lot of things that people might be afraid of doing if they have coprolalia, like things that are person facing, it might not be the coprolalia that's the problem, it's just the fear of how others are going to react to it. That could actually be the barrier. So yeah, tap the side.
A supportive employer can go a really long way. Seriously, just sometimes I know it sounds scary, it sounds silly, but sometimes just getting an ally or just getting outside validation, it's unfortunate that we require someone else to kind of quote unquote validate our accommodation.
Yeah.
But sometimes just that someone else validates our existence as we are helps others just go like, okay, right? If the employer says, this is how it is, you know, you can speak to your colleagues if there's anything, right? So if you are going to be in a customer facing position, yeah, of course, I would strongly encourage speaking to your colleagues about it. So yeah, getting collegial support, getting employer support has everything to do with it.
Yes, that is actually really, really good. Because the advice I think I've always been given is avoid person-facing jobs. But maybe I don't have to. Maybe I could do a person-facing job as long as I'm very good at like explaining or having a card or a sign to show people. Because I was actually gonna say, like, with severe coprolalia, maybe working from home and stuff. But to be fair, coprolalia might not stop you from doing a person-facing job as long as you can deal with others' reactions to it. An employer is not going to have you there for a few days and be like, I can't deal with this, because if they can't deal with it, we've dealt with it for years. I don't know, it just kind of odd. Yeah. So I think if it's important to bear that in mind, like, we don't want to be doing it. Like, it's not something we choose. We're not like, you know what, it's going to be so fun to just swear all the time. We're not, that's not what it is. No. So yeah, so I think it's important for employers and people to be mindful of that. It's not a choice, and we don't want to, like, you might not want to hear it, but we don't want to do it either. So that. But yes, I think people just having knowledge makes a huge difference. So as you said, explaining it to people if they don't have the prior knowledge can make a massive difference, because then they're not going to see it as much of an issue. Okay, tic attacks. I'm quite lucky that I've only ever had like a few, but I know some people who have really frequent tic attacks, and that may really make them anxious with work because they feel like that could affect them a lot. It could happen at any time. Is there any advice you'd give to people who have tic attacks regarding work and how to manage that?
Oof. Okay. As I was discovering myself as a Touretteer and getting to know myself as a Touretteer, I also discovered I'm autistic. So looking back, I experienced more shutdowns than tic attacks. It's weird. Most of my life I've gone into shutdown, which is autistic coding. But in the last few years, so once I first let myself tic freely and let my body do what it's supposed to do, I've also noticed that if I don't go into shutdown mode, I go into tic attack mode.
Yeah.
So both modes, I don't know what it's like for you, but I've noticed now that I know myself a little better, I've noticed that before a shutdown, I usually have a lot of warning signs. And it's the same with a tic attack. There's a lot of warning signs. So the best
Depends
way,
whether you're listening to them or not.
yeah, exactly, right? So that's where self-awareness comes into play. And that self-awareness does make a lot of us anxious and does affect our other conditions. So knowing yourself is very important. So knowing everything that leads up to that trigger. Granted, some of us have no warning or very little warning. If you know you're prone to tic attacks, again, safety first. Know yourself, know your environment. So again, the 3 elements. Know the Touretteer. So who is the Touretteer? How do they experience their Tourette's? So they experience it as rage attacks, tic attacks. So we have to look after the environment, the kind of a work environment we're going to work in. So it has to be a place that will either be aware of how to prevent tic attacks or how to provide space so that the tic attack is tic safety, really, and the kind of work you're going to do. So yeah, so starts with the Touretteer, always starts with the Touretteer. Who are you? How do you experience your Tourette? And what usually leads up to a tic attack. So usually, personally, we have some clues to that. Yeah. So, and as you say, when we don't pay attention to those clues,
that causes problems. I think it's because I definitely used to have, well, I might still do, but I used to have issues with actually listening to the signs because I could feel my tics getting worse and affecting my work an awful lot, but I still wouldn't take a break because I was like, it'll probably be fine, even though I know that if my tics are like that, they're going to keep escalating until I take a break. But I wouldn't listen to that. For some reason, I felt like it was bad if I would take a break then. So I just ended up triggering like really severe tic episodes because I didn't listen to myself. So if you do become aware of those signs, know that it's okay to take a break because it's better to just prevent the severe tic explosion, like rather than keep going and then have one, because when you have a severe tic explosion, you're going to miss work anyway. You're going to need to take a break at that point. So it's better to just take it earlier and prevent that. That's what I've had.
Yeah, because, well, tic attacks are very exhausting too, right? There's depending on the power of it, there's a recovery time. But you pointed something, I need to backtrack to something you said. You were working, you knew you were pushing yourself, and I'm listening, it's like, you were pushing yourself because you wanted to come through, right? You wanted to show you could do the work. And that's something that many of us do because we know we are perceived as, not necessarily being capable, and we need to prove ourselves. So many of us do that. And it's good that you recognize it now, because I still do that to myself sometimes. Yeah, it's Touretteer, know thyself.
With what you say about safety as well, I think maybe if you have some colleagues that you're really close to, you can just tell them what to do if you're having a tic attack. Like maybe just put a pillow under my head and make sure I'm safe and not injuring myself, just something like that. And also just having the accommodation, if you know the signs, to maybe go into another room, a smaller room, so that you don't have it like in front of everyone else if you don't feel comfortable with that. Like it can help to be in a separate room. Just make sure your employer knows that, and then you're like, if I feel that, I'm going to go into a separate room. And in case as well, just tell colleagues you're close to what to do if you're having like a really bad tic tac, and then it can help you feel a lot more prepared and less anxious about it as well, in case it was.
Yeah, when you feel like that's the work environment and the kind of work you do and the kind of colleagues you get and the kind of employer you have. Again, employers set the tone. If an employer is totally fine with saying, hey, you're doing a great job, of course I'm going to provide you with a room. Of course you can ask Joe and Jane, to keep an eye out, so if you drop, at least you're safe and they can go back to their thing and there's nothing to worry about. Just make sure that you're safe and keep an eye out. Having proper contingency plans, right? Knowing, as you say, knowing that it's there if you need it takes a lot of that worry away. For many of us, having that first tic attack, that first public tic attack, is a true test, right? It's kind of like, we're told that the accommodations are there, but are they really there when it happens? So going through that the first time and just looking at the willingness to do better every time. It is an accommodation, but again, prevention is key, because it takes so much out of a body. It's exhausting.
Definitely. So an employer definitely needs to be able to listen to when a person says, I can feel my tics getting bad. They haven't exploded yet, but I feel like they might be. I'm going to take a break. Mm-hmm. An employer shouldn't go, like, I hopefully none would do this, but an employer shouldn't go, they're not that bad right now, because you can't see how it feels for the person. We might be able to feel the urge to tic growing despite it not showing yet as well. So that we know ourselves best, really. Whether we listen to ourselves or what our body's saying is another thing, but we know ourselves best. So an employer should hopefully be able to listen to us when we say we need a break. I do also want to touch upon something you said, like if an employer doesn't accommodate you, that's not a reflection of you being like a bad employee. Some employers may just not be as open to stuff. They might be kind of stubborn, not as flexible. They might not be willing to accommodate. And if there's an employer like that, then I'm really sorry. That is not appropriate. But hopefully most employers are more accommodating and will do their job and accommodate you properly.
Yeah. On that note, remember how we were reviewing some questionable job posts?
Yes. Very questionable.
So a lot of employers say that they are inclusive and they encourage people with disability to apply, et cetera, but they don't offer benefits for like 6 months. So someone who's currently on disability benefits who wants to work but cannot survive without the benefits, and here in Canada, benefits means a drug plan, your meds are taken care of, and the health basics are taken care of. So your meds are taken care of. Not having access to meds for 6 months kind of disqualifies you. So any employer that's out there that says they want disabled people to apply but don't offer benefits is not an inclusive employer. Right there, that's exclusion. That's an easy sign, because most of the time those benefits are non-negotiable, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, so that's your first clue. If they say disabled people are welcome to apply, but you can only have benefits after a certain time, not inclusive.
On my list of things which people may think are barriers or feel are barriers for them, one I put is poor sleep. And the reason I put that is because some people may find it difficult to sleep because of tics. Some people may have that sort of issue. And then if they don't sleep well, they may like not sleep at all, and then they may struggle to be able to go to work, because like going to work on hardly any sleep again and again and again will take a toll on someone. Is there any advice you would give there? I personally think I would say maybe there's an option to like do a job that's later hours, so that you can maybe sleep in the morning if it takes you ages to get to sleep, and have that flexibility rather than a 9 to 5. Maybe there's a job that starts in the afternoon and ends later. What would you say? Beans.
So if you're a night owl and you know it and you want to work, then you choose work that's within those hours. Really, don't try to force, like, especially if you know your body has a difficult time waking up at a certain time and you need that kind of flexibility, go with your natural bodily rhythm and find work that will allow for you to work within those hours. There's some work that can be done remotely at any time, as long as you do your 8 hours, or as long as you can show the work is getting done. So those are great options. And there's also, if you know your body, if you know you're waking up at 1 p.m. every day and that's how your rhythm works, then you find something that works within those hours as well. Start with a Touretteer.
Because I know some people have told me that their tics can affect their ability to get to sleep, but then there's also like co-occurring sleep issues as well, even sleep issues that aren't related to the tics. And then people might not be able to sleep straight away. It may take them hours to sleep, meaning that they're not getting enough sleep. So if a person's sleep cycle is kind of off from what the typical sleep cycle is for most people, then a job that starts later may be what works.
Yeah. Honor your body schedule. So for example, if call centers, some people need overnight people, right? So there's options.
Yes. What advice would you give to someone who is able to work, but they feel like they need to suppress, and the suppression is what's causing harm to them, but they feel like they have to suppress to be able to keep doing their job? What would you say to them? I guess it depends on their reason for suppressing.
This is very individual. It really comes down to self-acceptance. It's not just self-acceptance. Again, it's 3 factors all the time. There's a Touretteer, the work environment, and the type of work. Suppressing, I don't recommend. Suppressing, masking, I don't recommend. So if you're in a place where you can't let your tics be, if the job can be done remotely, then do the job remotely or in a quiet space. If you're a person that needs to go to work, because some people are extroverted and like to see the people, you go to work, you have your private workspace, but you still have the social aspect of work. And some people are fine to work from home, depending, again, on who you are and the kind of work you do. But it really starts with getting to know yourself as a Touretteer. And yes, there are social realities. There are very embedded biases out there that we have to contend with, and the vast majority of us are very aware. It's very personal, but I don't recommend suppression. Again, it makes you more likely to burn out in your young 40s, which is too young to burn out.
Yeah. And then also it can trigger tic attacks and stuff, which then is going to deplete your energy further and further and further. So yeah, I also do not recommend suppression, because that's unfortunately probably going to do more harm, especially in the long run. Do you think a person should talk to their employer about it if they're in that sort of situation, and maybe talk to them about how they feel like they are struggling to tick freely in the workplace and then get the employer to reassure them, to say it's okay, you can let it out. I feel like that might help some people feel less anxious about ticking freely, but then would an employer understand what they really mean when they're talking about suppression is the question.
So first of all, the vast majority of the time, and I don't mean to scare anyone here, having those conversations, the responsibility usually falls on us to make the employer feel comfortable, because for most people, difference is a very scary thing to face, right? It's very predictable when you're used to it, but it's unpredictable because it's outside of that quote unquote box that we all talk about. So be prepared, first of all, to make your employer comfortable with it. So first of all, you have to be comfortable with it. So depending on the work you do, if you are tired of suppressing, if it's an office job that can be done remotely, and most office jobs can be done remotely, you can ask to work from home, or ask for personal space in the office, but be prepared to be the one to have to make the employer feel comfortable about it. So you have to be very comfortable with it. So start with, do you want to reveal you have tics or not?
Beans!
So if you need the accommodation, but you don't want to say you have Tourette syndrome, you can get a note from your doctor saying, Romy requires a quiet work environment to perform her work. It is recommended that she perform her duties from home.
So disclose their diagnosis.
I don't know what it's like in the UK, but it's probably very similar to Canada and the US. They don't have the right to ask you what your disability is, but you can ask for an accommodation. So if the doctor says Romy needs a quiet work environment, so either give her a private space or let her work from home. If we presume that you can do all that work from home, which in most instances can be done, then yes. If it's something where you're required to be physically present, like a retail store, it really depends. Do you want to keep being in a customer-facing situation? Or do you want to work in the back, or do you want to look for a completely different work environment? So depending on what you want. So again, if you're in retail, and you want to stop suppressing, it depends on what you want. Do you want to keep being in that customer-facing environment and just let yourself tick freely? Or do you want to do something a little different? Do you want to have your duties adjusted, right? Like you might want to stay with an employer that you like, feel comfortable with, have established how well you already do, and say, listen, I think I would rather to work in the back. Is that possible? So those are things you can request. Again, I don't know what it's like globally, but in Canada and the US, and probably something very similar in colonized countries. Yeah, if you have a note from your doctor stating what your accommodation need is, it's usually fine. You usually don't have to go further than that unless, yeah. usually if they have to go through a reassessment, et cetera, it's from a workplace injury, and it's a very different approach.
So people have the option to either stay with what they're doing and tick freely with that and I guess see how it goes, or they have the option to stay with an employer but do a different role in a different part of the building or whatever, or work from home, or just look for a completely different job that may suit them better with their needs.
Right. So, for example, here's what not to do. So if you go to your employer and you have your accommodations and everything is set up, and then your employer says, well, yeah, I can accommodate you, but not on a Monday or a Friday.
Am I just gonna not have a disability on Monday or Friday?
Right.
That's
so when an employer or a boss tells you that, they're quite literally signaling to you that they really don't want you to be working from the cottage. Because, you know, if you're working and doing the work like you're supposed to, but then you close the computer and you're already at the cottage, that's really not fair to the rest of the people. And that's, what's your concern? I'm doing the work. I'm doing the work. So having an employer that signals to you that they don't trust you, they think you're just taking a long weekend, it's, yeah, that's someone that's not really understanding of your needs. So again, you have the choice. Do you fight for yourself? Like, yeah, things I wish I knew back then.
Some people may have tics that make them find it difficult to write and type. Wow. And people may feel like that's a big barrier to their work. What sort of things would you recommend in that case? Beans.
So depending on what it is, so if it's fine motor skills type tics, that are kind of intermittent. So sometimes if you can type, but sometimes you can't. Again, a voice to text is a very, very, very useful tool. Whether you can type or not. As a writer, I personally prefer to write with pen and paper. I'm very old-fashioned that way. But when it comes to getting ideas out, sometimes a voice to text is your best friend.
I agree that voice to text can be very helpful, but then when you have vocal tics, you have to get back and delete.
Right. Yeah, there is that element.
But overall, it can be very helpful.
Yeah.
But also, one issue I have found with voice to text, because I did have to use it a lot, is it doesn't always pick up everything correctly, so you have to go back all the way through it from the beginning, and edit, because sometimes it will just pick up the wrong word altogether.
Right.
So I feel like that would work a lot of the time to have voice to text, but then I feel like there are some situations when people have difficulty focusing, when they might struggle to do that because they might not be able to go back and like pay attention to all the little details. That's just something I found anyway, because I had difficulty writing, so I'd use voice to text, but then I also had like hyperactivity and inattention, so then I couldn't go back and edit it. Yeah, so I feel like that's definitely a good thing for a lot of people. But if you struggle with that, and I don't know, if you're looking for another job, then maybe a more physical job would be better, one that not like an office job, but maybe something like supervising, like I said before, or just maybe craft stuff that, well, like fine motor as well, but something that doesn't require you to like write or type, something that's not like an office job, maybe something creative, or something just where you have to be physically present but not do office work. Beans.
Right. So again, that whole idea of supervisor, I really like the idea of a supervisor. Those, seriously, those are great jobs. So you can still do the job, depending on the amount of physical work that you require doing. Again, some of us, our physical tics are lessened when they are redirected into physical work. So Touretteer, who's a Touretteer? What does a Touretteer want and need? Work environment, type of work. So those are three aspects to always consider. Yourself as a Touretteer, as much as you can, right? The rest is up to the employers and the colleagues, but the employer sets the tone.
Wow. And if the employer isn't accommodating, then it might actually not be the best workplace for you. You should probably consider another job, because you're probably not going to get on well at a place where the employer is just very stubborn and not the support that you need. And in the UK, actually, I think it might be, I think it might be illegal to not give someone the right accommodations, because we have the Equality Act 2010, and it has protected characteristics, one of which is disability, and it says that reasonable adjustments must be made, and I think that's kind of legally binding. And I don't think that only applies to schools. I know it does apply to schools, but I think it must also apply to the workplace. So there may also be a law about what your employer can or cannot do, and if they're not accommodating you, it can actually be seen as discrimination.
Yeah, very true. I don't know what it's like in the UK. We've got something very similar in Canada and the US. In Canada, at the very least, those are very difficult to enforce. So yeah, they have to be very big and blatant and obvious and case making to enforce, because it's expensive. Are you okay?
Yeah, you okay? I just bit a banana peel.
Well, better the banana peel than your hand.
I'm like, that is not how you eat a banana. My tongue's just a bit straight.
So in Canada, yeah, we've got something very similar in Canada and the US. I think the US actually has a better, like the American with Disabilities Act, I think is much better than what we have in Canada.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's still very difficult to enforce. And there's, yeah, unless it's big and blatant and obvious, it's very difficult to enforce.
I feel like it must also be kind of expensive to enforce if you do need like a lawyer and everything as well.
Yeah. So a lot of people do not have the resources to follow up or follow through, and let's face it, the vast majority of lawyers will not take pro bono cases.
So it's probably easier for people, if they're in that sort of situation, just to consider looking for another job for another employer and hope that the new employer is a lot more open to helping you.
Well, first of all, try to make it work with your current employer. First of all, in terms of argument, so first of all, if you're an existing employee and you require accommodations, it costs a lot less to accommodate you than to train a new person. So you've got a really solid business argument there. So that could help you. So try to show that you've tried to get accommodated, that you've tried to find ways to keep your performance optimal. That's what they want to hear. So you try to show that you've found ways or tried to find ways to improve your performance and make it optimal. So try to show that you came up with solutions as much as you can. Yeah, just try to show that you're trying to solve problems, first of all. If you have the ability to look for work as you're working, then do that.
One is that dealing with fatigue, like if a person's tics make them really tired, and that can then affect their work performance, what would they do in that situation if their tics are so physical and stuff that it really drains their energy? Beans.
Okay, again, we're going to go back to the Touretteer, your
Yeah.
needs, your environment. So if you know this is how your body works, just try to find something that you can have a flexible schedule. And again, most employers already have a flex plan that they offer to parents. I don't see how that flex plan could not extend to Touretteers or other neurodivergent or otherwise disabled individuals. Yeah, so find the type of work that you have that kind of flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Flexibility is really, really important, and also just maybe accommodations like the break thing as well. That would kind of come under the flexi hours as well. So yes, and the last thing on this list is that this one is kind of similar to what we've already covered with the discrimination stuff, but someone in the workplace with tics being bullied and harassed for it. What would you say to them if they're around employees and things who really aren't understanding?
Okay. This is rarely, this rarely has to do, okay, so if you're a Touretteer experiencing something like this, first of all, none of this is your fault, okay? Mm-hmm. None of this is your fault. Bullying in the workplace is very serious, whether you're a Touretteer, whether you, like any kind of deviation from the norm, makes you a target for bullying. That's the reality of things. A good employer will not tolerate bullying and will set the pace that way, right? So it really comes down to what a manager or an employer is willing to tolerate. And unfortunately, in many cases, they let it go on. And that's not okay. Try to solve the problem first. And if that persists, again, you need to have allies in the workplace. Yeah, it really comes down to what your work environment will tolerate. It's unfortunate. So yeah, when you notice that your workplace will tolerate a group of employees picking on a colleague, or treating a colleague very differently, any employer that's willing to tolerate that, you probably don't want to work for anyway. So again, if you have the ability to get another job, you go right ahead and get another job.
Do you think it's important for people to try to stick up for themselves in that situation, or could that escalate?
Depending on the situation, right? So if it's a first time and it's new, just ask for clarification all the time, right? So depending on the situation. So if the bully wants you to respond a certain way, and you can always ask the bully, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you repeat yourself? Ask them to repeat themselves. Yeah. And if it's still offensive, ask them to repeat themselves again. So start with that. So usually someone will realize what they're doing. So a decent person will realize they pushed it too far and go, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean like that, and have a conversation. So if it's not intentional, yeah, but the first thing I would do is ask them to repeat themselves.
Yeah.
Loudly for everyone to hear.
Yes. Okay, yes.
That would be my first thing, but that's me, and it's not everyone who's comfortable with something like that. So if you're not able to ask them to repeat themselves, you can disengage altogether, right? So if it's persistent and happening all the time, you can just walk away and go to your manager. Like when it gets to that point, and it should not, you go straight to your manager. But always start by asking a person to repeat themselves.
But hopefully this sort of situation isn't common, so I don't want to like scare anybody by talking about this, because there are very decent employers out there, I'm sure.
Right.
And it really, I mean, it depends on the employer as well, what sort of person they are, and what, as you said, what they will tolerate. Interestingly, I've heard some people talk about how this is kind of on the topic, but kind of not. But I think certain settings might be more accepting, more understanding, because I know someone in a group who was saying how they work in the healthcare sector and they actually have been very understanding because they've been around people with tics before, because they work in healthcare, so they're already aware of what it is and that the person obviously can't help it. So I think it really also depends on the type of sector you're in as to what level of understanding people will probably have.
Yeah. Yeah, so some people go into certain environments expecting to be welcomed and accommodated, and it's not the case. And then you go in other environments and you will be accommodated and treated fairly and equitably. And
that should be how people are treated everywhere.
Right. Yeah. So again, the Touretteer. Who are you as a Touretteer? What environments are you comfortable with? What kind of work do you want to do?
Strippers. No, not that.
Yeah.
I don't want to.
So some healthcare, some hospitals might be great. Some hospital might not be so great, right? So it really comes down to the employer. So it might be the same industry. So one hospital might be great. One hospital might not be so great. Ideally, there would be proper policies in place at every level of government, right? So there would be proper policies established countrywide. There would be that would kind of require employers to reconsider their own policies. One of the problems that I'm hearing the most of is there's all sorts of ways to get us employed, but once we're there, the supports are not there. That's a big complaint, because if employers always rely on outside help to keep us, to either hire us or keep us hired, it takes away their responsibility, right? And it never quite makes it to policy. So it does not, it needs to become part of the culture, right? And unfortunately, to become part of the culture, it has to be embedded in the policy. It has to be how managers and leaders and all the vice presidents and the board of directors deal with it. So there's a lot of people making a lot of decisions. So by the time you are excluded, you've been excluded many ways, right? So it's not just your manager excluding you, it's the employer that allows the manager to exclude you. It's a society that allows for the policies to be a little blurry. It's the country establishing those policies. So there's a lot of people involved in letting those things like that happen. So it's fixable. It's fixable. It's something that can be fixed. It's something that can be managed. Yeah, I think it's down to governments to require employers to have better policies and to really start dealing with inclusion in-house, rather than relying on outside support and making it very transactional, right? So instead of creating careers, we're creating, oh, okay, we hired a bunch of people. Okay, well, they can't grow, so we're going to hire a whole new bunch of people. Yeah, so that's my personal opinion, of course. That's how I perceive it, but it's obviously oversimplifying it. But there's a lot of ways this can be fixed.
Hopefully policies will change so that employers can't get away with discrimination and so that the work environments are genuinely inclusive, and that the employees can't get away with harassing someone for being different, and so that also us as ourselves have the confidence to be able to stick up for ourselves as well when necessary, like that thing where you said where you ask people to repeat and stuff. We also have to have the confidence to be able to stick up for ourselves and just be like, make it clear to people that that's not okay. But yes, thank you so much. I think that's actually, well, everything related to tics on here now, so we did it.
We did it! Yay! Yay, Romy!
Thank you so much for doing this and for taking the time to do this. We've been talking for pretty much almost an hour and a half now, so it's been really, really lovely to talk to you again, and your expertise is always very valued, so thank you very much. Beans.
Well, you always have the best questions, and you also force me to reconsider things and to expand my perspectives. I appreciate that a great deal. Thank you so much for having me back.